So one of the reasons why we wanted to put these little videos together was to try and get a sense of how perhaps in each decade something moved on in our field. And if you look at the 1980s as a sort of block of time, do you have a sense of movement or progression in our field, things that particularly resonated as being 80s phenomena?
Well, I think the 80s was quite a remarkable decade, and I hadn't maybe put that together as the 80s as a block until asked to talk about the 80s as though they were a coherent entity, which in many ways they were not, especially when you look across the US versus the UK.
Yes.
But looking at the UK, I could see that there are kind of bookends. So when I entered into language testing through the British side of things, everyone was talking about communicative language testing. ELTS had just emerged. It was in its, I think, first year of full action. There were a tiny number of test takers in those days. And I do remember that late in the 80s, I saw a document which was celebrating the fact that ELTS had exceeded 10,000 test takers in whatever year that was, 88 maybe. And of course, it's just grown so enormously since. So that is definitely a change. It's a change for all language testing, I think. But that also is, in terms of British testing, very much due to what was so special about ELTS and then IELTS, because not only did that lead to notoriety among particularly US testers, but also to fame. So it pulled attention to itself. So we were all, and the 1980 volume of English Language Testing Journal was the report of, I think that was the first LTF, which was, what were there, a dozen people who were there. And I think everyone gave a paper at that. And maybe all but one were published in that early volume, which I don't have, but I do have a number of the papers. Very, very interesting looking back on that. And then, of course, by the end of the 1980s, there was a volume published looking at the ELTS Rev, I think it was called at that time.
That's right, yes.
Which the ELTS revision project was, came in because the ELTS validation project was in some ways a failure. Statistically, it was a failure because, as we might have realized, although there was a large number of test takers and I can testify there was a huge amount of data. But there was a huge number of cells.
Yes.
If you think of your Excel spreadsheet, the infamous Excel spreadsheet, which NHS couldn't fit 60 million people on.
Correct.
Well, we managed to fit in 6,000 or so ELTS candidates. But because of all those modules, and because of all the countries, Clive Kryper insisted that every country should be its own cell. We had thousands and thousands of cells with one or two people in them. And so you couldn't get any statistical meaningfulness out of those analyses. You had to compress them and compress them and compress them. Then it became so general that it wasn't about specific anything at all. Which, of course, a lot was learned from failures there. And the ELTS revision project did a lot to not solve, but certainly to ameliorate that. And that volume of the ELTS research reports came out, I think, in 1989. I think it was number 3, so probably late 1989. So that's a huge history inside there. And yeah, so communicative language testing, which was such a huge it figured so enormously in British language testing, was sort of like a very much a side issue in the US, really quite irrelevant. When I began, and Bernard Spolsky has written about this quite interestingly, as a sort of American, starting as a New Zealander and then having spent many more years in Israel, he's sort of, not really one particular school of language testing. So he's got a distanced view. The British work made very little impression in the US. And if I'm allowed a side comment, that's still the case. I remember only a couple of years ago, someone putting something on the LTest, the language testing list, mentioning Cyril Weir's socio-cognitive model. Jim Purpura saying nobody in the US has any interest in the socio-cognitive model, which was actually quite unlike Jim. He's usually much kinder than that. But in a way, it wasn't untrue. So there was a lot happening in UK. And my work fitted into that because I was looking at writing, and I totally believed in writing as a communicative process. And I believed in the visibility concept, although Alan Davis never really did. We had some great conversations about that.
I can imagine.
So those things were very, very British.
Yeah.
And yet I was also at least as comfortable in my US persona as well.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, there was, yes, I suppose it is this thing which I was alluding to a moment ago, which it is still true, I think, that there is a divide between philosophies and practices of language testing in the UK and in the United States. Because the US began with a psychometric tradition, not only unapologetically glorying in the psychometric tradition. And people will often talk about the Yerkes test, which really
with the military.
Yes, infamous to many of us. Military testing, which one of the things that it did was to, I don't know how I should put this these days, identify and treat differently people of colour, people of relatively lower intelligence. And not that they were not allowed in the military at all, but they were shunted into, well, some of them weren't allowed in the military at all, but they were shunted into different kinds of military careers. And a lot of unpleasant things came out of the particular ways that psychometrics were used, which I think the US is still got the what do the Australians call it, the the chip on the shoulder. People get a kind of a cultural when they get questioned about the psychometrics, because some very bad things did happen, but some amazingly good things, of course, have happened as well. Whereas Britain very much always went from, and if you look right back to the beginning of Cambridge assessment and the little that was before that, it grew out of needs. People needed for particular roles, like the East India Service, the Foreign Service, but being tested by upper class gents with asking them some nice questions. What used to be called, who was it? Someone in the British Council whose name I don't remember, and it's probably just as well, told me it used to be called the British Council Subjective Test.
Oh, right.
Which meant you'd pop in to see the,
Yes.
the ambassador or the whomever,
Yeah.
and they talk to you for 2 or 3 minutes in English and then give you the chop that you could go.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I suppose there was always a stronger relationship with the world of education.
Yes.
Between testing, assessment, and
absolutely,
and
absolutely
language education.
Yes.
So good morning to Nick, and the first thing I'd like to ask you is when did you first go to an LTF event?
Oh, hi Jane. Yeah, well, actually I have a very clear recollection of my first LTF, which was in December 1994. We organised that event in Cambridge. It had been thought up jointly, I think, by Charles Alderson and Mike Milanovic, and we offered to host it in Cambridge on the theme of computers in language testing. I can also remember that there was a pattern emerging of how we organized the event. It was sort of by invitation only to a small group of people. People brought along their presentations, and they weren't vetted in any way. We delivered them there across, I think it was a Friday through Sunday, and we always had a dinner.
Be interested to know, you were already in Cambridge involved in testing then in the early 90s. That was already a field, was it?
I joined in 89 to form with Mike Milanovic the first EFL evaluation unit, just a few of us, with a view to setting up research and validation for the Cambridge exams. Before that, I'd been working in Italy. I had to take up a job teaching English. After about a week there, I'd find myself involved in assessment. But lucky enough to have a colleague who'd done a master's degree in Reading and had come across the likes of Arthur Hughes and Don Porter. So my interest had been sparked, but there wasn't much of a community back in the 80s. I wasn't aware of LTF and that community until I went back to Reading in the mid-80s to do my master's. So when I came back to Cambridge, it was a very exciting period because I could see the field beginning to emerge in places like Reading and Lancaster in the UK. And we'd begun working with Lyle Bachman on the Cambridge TOEFL comparability study and those sort of rather unusual developments which we're seeing. So that's me, but I think 1989 was also an exciting time for other reasons, a good time to be getting involved in language testing in the way we were, because it saw the coming down of the Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain, and in the institutions of Europe, like the Council of Europe and the European Union, the emergence of issues to do with mobility, European citizenship, language learning for those purposes, and along with it, initiatives which saw the growth of the industry really around language learning and assessment.
Well, I was just thinking where I was in a language school that had, in the middle of Asia, that had one computer for 25 teachers. So I'm interested in your conference on testing and computers.
Well, I think people already realized by then that technology would play an increasingly important role in the assessment industry and in language learning more generally. And we hadn't yet adopted the internet and email and so on. So we were speculating that by the turn of the century, we might see the developments which would have moved us into a much more technology-based model. But I remember my presentation that was on the whole process from ideation through to results could be improved, even if it was a paper and pen test, if you were supported by effective technologies. So I think there was quite a broad-ranging discussion, but still fairly primitive. You know, we to think that the devices era only really started in about 2007 or 8 when the iPhone came along. So now we talk about data and devices. Back then it was something sort of nailed to the desk.
I remember mainly just a focus on sort of the day-to-day teaching in school environments, college environments, where your textbook was sort of your curriculum and you did the tests in the back. I don't remember a great focus on testing out there, you know, outside the UK.
I don't really think there was anywhere a particularly strong community of practice around language assessment. So the establishment in the 1990s onwards of communities, associations, groups, regional groups of people, like-minded people who were interested in coming together to talk about language testing and its impact. I think that was the era. So one of the things we did in Cambridge was to seek to get together with other organizations which were testing their languages internationally to create that kind of forum. So a multilingual focus. And that led us to ALTE. I think it was one of the first, but it's been part of a trend which we've seen happening internationally to create groups, of which LTF and now UCALTA is an example in the UK context. So what was happening back in those early 90s? Well, I attended my first LTRC. My first one was at ETS in 1991. And then the following year in Vancouver. And that was actually a very important meeting because we came up with the idea of ILTA and the need to establish our code of ethics and code of practice. And from that beginning, we've seen the expansion of the International Language Testing Association and the role of the LTRC conference. I remember also the year before that, LTF, it was the year we brought LTRC to Europe for the first time. So the internationalization of LTRC happened, and it was tying in with the fact that ILA was happening in Netherlands that year. But since then, as you know, we've seen LTRC expand, and it went to Japan for the first time and saw the birth of the Japanese Language Testing Association towards the end of the 90s.
Apart from talking about how important it is to collaborate and the setting up of these communities of practice, were there any key debates at that time, do you think?
Well, clearly the emergence of a common framework of reference and how you can establish levels of proficiency for languages in a multilingual way across all languages in all contexts was the big theme. So 1991 saw the second Rushikon conference, which led to the project which developed the Common European Framework of Reference and the European language portfolio. It was set against that background of the moment is now right for this sort of thing. And in the Council of Europe, we had this program between 1989 and 96, which was the Language Learning for European Citizenship, which saw the birth of the team that led to the CFR, and the first version of it, 1996. And that was being seen in conjunction with activities elsewhere. So the ALTE framework and the emerging ALTE association was used as a sounding board for the development and participated in the development of the CFR. So there was a sort of coming together around that theme of frameworks. And actually, the European Union, which is the EU, was moving towards its single market. And in the background there was the birth of something called the Lingua Program, which had a number of actions which you could apply for funding. I remember vividly helping to write submissions to the Lingua program to get funding for the ALTE work. So the two European institutions were supporting language learning, and within that, if you like, assessment was nested. And of course, when the CFR was published in 2001, the big deal was the scale, and obviously assessment issues probably dominated for a long time in the public debate.
Unfortunately, that's probably all we've got time for. So thanks very much, Nick.
Good morning, Tony.
Hi.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you a few questions about your experiences with language testing and assessment during the noughties. I believe you were a student in the early 2000s?
That's right, yeah. So my career in language assessment really had started in the 1990s. And I guess I was what you'd call an institutional language tester, in that I was working as an English teacher, and as part of my duties, I was on in the testing unit, I suppose, in the college where I was working, and had read books like Arthur Hughes' Testing for Language Teachers and Cyril Weir's Community of Language Testing, and was looking to kind of develop my career a bit further in this area. And I'd done a master's course at Reading in language testing at the end of the 90s, and went on to do my PhD, initially with Arthur Hughes, and then moved over to Cyril Weir, who promptly then moved over to Roehampton University, as it is now, University of Surrey, Roehampton, as it was then. And I moved with him. So as the 2000s opened, I just started on my PhD.
So what was your PhD about?
So I was looking at the washback of the IELTS test. So I was working by that time as a teacher of English for academic purposes, working on the pre-sessional courses at Reading University and at Roehampton, and actually in a couple of other places as well, as a sort of a sessional lecturer, and saw how important IELTS was to the lives of the students I was working with, and was interested in exploring in some detail how IELTS impacted on what they did to prepare for their lives as international students. And this was an area that was becoming of interest in language assessment research anyway. So a lot of people sort of spurred on by work done in the early 90s. And I think particularly by Arthur Hughes' book, where he was talking so much about the effects that testing had on language teachers. And so I'm interested to see how that worked with my students.
And was that the book you published as well? Was that based on your research?
It did become eventually, much later in the 2000s, it became the book IELTS, IELTS Washback in Context.
So can you tell me a little bit more about what happened next? So after you finished your studies, how did your career develop over the
So through the 2000s, I kind of went from being a student to being a professional language tester. I went to work for Cambridge English, and then went back into academia in 2006 and joined Crella, where I've been ever since.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience at Crella at the time?
So when Crella started, it was essentially just Cyril Weir and Roger Hawkey who were there. So I was the third recruit. We were very small. We had a handful of students. And it was a time when I'd just been working on his book on language testing and validation and developing the socio-cognitive framework. So it was sort of early work on applying that to different areas.
Well, actually, that ties in very nicely about my question about what kind of progress do you think was made in terms of UK test design and validation over the period. So can you tell us a little bit more about the model?
So I think in the context of the time, so language testing was moving really, UK language testing was moving from something that was really pretty small scale. I think Liz has already talked about the English proficiency testing that was done by Alan Davis and colleagues in the 1970s up to 1980. And even ELTS had been very small numbers of test takers. IELTS by 2000 was up to something like 250,000, but it was still a relatively small scale test. So when I joined Cambridge, it was a lot of the work was being done about gearing IELTS up to become something that could be delivered on a massive scale. So I think when there were only 3 versions of EPTB ever produced, and that could be done because they were given to very small numbers of test takers who never were in touch with each other. By this time, IELTS, they had to produce a new version of IELTS for every week of the year because it had to be given to such large numbers of people. Right. And that meant a big change in the kind of systems that lay behind the test and the way in which tests could be produced and the role that specifications and validation could play in the operation of a test on that sort of scale. So there was this big shift in UK language assessment towards an industrialization, sort of massification of testing industry. And I think that the socio-cognitive framework came in at a time when that was really needed, because there had to be a much more systematic way of planning tests and the content of tests and producing consistent specification, but also of conveying to people what the test was and how the test was conceived in a way that hadn't really been done before. I mean, there were test specifications, obviously, but they weren't really, they were secretive documents. They were internal, sort of kept very much within a testing organization, rather than something to communicate what the test was about to the world. The world was just supposed to trust the test takers. But I think there was another development at the beginning of the 2000s, and Alana Shohami's book, particularly on critical language testing, about how we shouldn't trust testers, and that maybe testers were up to something fairly nefarious. So we should keep them under scrutiny and hold them to account for what they were about. And I think socio-cognitive framework gave UK testing and the wider world of testing as well, that had contact with it, a way to justify what they did.
Right, that's fantastic. Thank you. So, you know, this is going to be the 40th anniversary of LTF. So inevitably, there'll be some questions about LTF. I understand that the first time you attended was in 2000 in Bristol. Can you tell us a little bit about that event?
So LTF was a very different beast in 2000 from the way it later became. So in Bristol in 2000, it was mostly people who were involved as academic language testers getting together for sort of a country house weekend.
Right.
we sat around a table, and the higher level language testing academics would deliver their papers on what they were currently researching, and we'd sit at their feet and listen to them.
So how small was it when you say sit around the table?
About 15 or 20 people.
Right, so very small.
Very small.
Yeah.
And we'd have there was a reception the Friday night and a dinner on the Saturday, I think it was. And it was literally, we just sort of moved from the table in the building in the university to sitting around a table in a restaurant and carry on the conversation. The first time when I wanted to present at a language testing forum, it was 2 years later in Reading. And I was not allowed to present because I was only a student. So I could give a poster, but I was not allowed to give a presentation because I was not.
I am sorry to hear that. As you know, now we do have student presentations.
Yeah, so by the end of the 2000s, in 2009, when we hosted in Krella, I think that's the first time it really became more of a conference. So we massively expanded. I think the previous year, the numbers were probably around 50, but we went up to somewhere around 90 people at the conference, and students were allowed to present. And much more like the kind of typical conference setup than you'd see at the beginning.
Anything in particular you remember about the 2009 conference at Krella?
Well, what really impressed me, I think, was Alan Davis, and he was clearly the grand old man, the kind of elder statesman of language testing through those LTFs. And it wasn't just that one at Bristol, but he would kind of sit and listen with his eyes closed. You were never quite sure whether he was awake or asleep. And then he would always get the first question. So he would pop up at the end of the presentation and he would ask some really incisive question that would completely floor the presenter. But everybody deferred to him. He was clear. I think he'd been the teacher for a lot of the people who were present. So yes, he was a look up to as the definitely he was the one who held the whip hand over the rest of them.
And what do you think has been the role of LTF at the time in the UK and the field of language testing?
I think LTF was it was a great way of bringing people together. So people who are working, it was a fairly isolated, I suppose it still is, a fairly isolating and lonely existence being a language tester in applied linguistics, because it had a slightly different direction. And I think that's one of the things that has changed, that a lot of those people who were at the centre of attention in LTF in 2000, they were essentially applied linguists who developed an interest in language testing. The sort of level of professionalisation where you now have people who develop all through their careers just as language testers hadn't really started at that point. It was only just beginning to get underway. So I think it was a way of bringing the community together. But also, even at that time, you had people from language testing organisations joining us as well. So it was keeping the academics in touch with the wider world of the practice of language testing. I think that's been really important. The ways that LTF has really helped to give a certain coherence to the work of the industry and the work of the academics.
That's great. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to share with people listening about your experiences in the noughties?
Probably nothing more feasible.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Nahal.
Welcome to this short reflection on our field, in which we focus on the last decade, starting in 2010. My name is Santi Lestari.
And I am Camilo Ramos, and we're both doctoral students at Lancaster University.
In this video, we will interview Professor Tineke Brunfaut from Lancaster University. Tineke, how did you first get involved in language testing and assessment?
Well, in the early 2000s, I was working on a research project with Professor Victor Webb at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And that project aimed to explore the role of the medium of instruction in vocational schools. It was an experimental study with a pre-test and a post-test design. And as part of that, we wanted to measure the students' language proficiency in English and in Northern Sotho, which were the two mediums of instruction we were focusing on in the study. But as you know, developing such tests is not a matter of just sitting down and quickly devising something. But I was fortunate enough to meet Professor Alan Davis while working on the project, and he gave me his videotapes, mark my words, which introduce key concepts in language testing. He also recommended some books, and he said, oh, I heard that Lancaster University is starting a summer school in language testing. So the next thing I knew was I was spending my summer at Lancaster with Rita Green, Caroline Clapham, Charles Alderson, Diane Wall, Jay Banerjee. And well, they clearly did a brilliant job at selling language testing as an important field in applied linguistics. So I started specializing in this area.
Wonderful start. In this interview, the aim is to focus on the period starting from 2010. Can you tell us a bit about your own experience of language testing and assessment during this last decade? Are there any particular developments that you think impacted on LTA theory and practice during the 2010s in the UK?
Mm-hmm. Well, by 2010, I think we can say that language testing was certainly a very firmly developed and recognized field within applied linguistics, having its own professional organizations such as ILTA, IALTA. So in the past decade, we've been able to build on this further. Validation frameworks such as the argument-based and the socio-cognitive approaches were quite well established by 2010. But I think one thing we've seen in these last 10 years is a larger uptake of these approaches and their implementation in a lot of empirical research as well as in test development. And I think also before that, before 2010, sort of during the 2000s, even earlier, there had also been many calls for cross-fertilization with other fields within applied linguistics, as well as other disciplines. And I think some structures had been set up to encourage such collaborations, for example, the SLAT network in Europe. But I think that they only really took off and happened on a much larger scale in the 2010s. If we look back at the LTF programs of the last 10 years, then you can see a lot of work has been presented that results from these kind of collaborations with, for example, SLA researchers, psycholinguists, corpus linguists, and so on. And that work has developed and informed the constructs that underlie our tests, but also the methodologies of our work. For example, refining linguistic and discourse measures, adopting eye-tracking technology, and all of that in light of the specific research questions and operational needs we have in language testing. And I think it is fair to say that several scholars in the UK have actually been at the forefront of these types of innovations. And that has allowed us to gain more detailed and new insights into language testing issues, I think specifically or especially from a cognitive perspective.
So lots of interesting things happening actually. As a first-year PhD student who moved to the UK from abroad, I haven't actually been able to attend any language testing forum yet. Could you tell me more about it? And do you recall any LTF gatherings during the 2010s that were particularly important? And what do you think LTF has contributed to the field in the UK?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first LTF of the decade was certainly a very memorable one for me. It was on the one hand the 30th celebration of the LTF, but I also found myself organizing that 2010 conference in Lancaster. So it was a great way to learn more about how the field had evolved within the UK since the first LTF in 1980 and where it had got to at that point in 2010. And it brought together people who had been there in the early years, but in the meantime retired or were about to retire, and so for whom this was one of the last LTFs they attended. With a new generation of language testing researchers for whom this was one of the first LTFs they attended. And of course also the important group of the mid-career scholars and operational language testers. So I think that 2010 forum really connected different generations of UK-based language testers. And then with the LTFs that have followed after that in the last 10 years, in many cases, these were organized by the new generation. With those LTF, we've traveled about all corners of England with conferences from Warwick to Southampton to Huddersfield, and then last year to Wales at Swansea University. And the forum has really scaled up in size a lot in those 10 years, and it runs now as in a sort of conventional conference format, which is quite different from these round-the-table discussions that were held by a select group of experts in the 80s. And I think one other thing that in particular that should be highlighted for this last decade is that out of LTF, the UK Association for Language Testing and Assessment was set up to ensure a stable home for the forum, as well as to broaden our mission, I think, as language testers in the UK, and to give us an official voice towards other stakeholders.
Sounds really exciting. Now, finally, to round off this brief interview, what are your expectations for the next decade of LTF?
Well, I'm confident that it will remain a low-stakes forum that brings together people from all levels of seniority with an interest in language testing, and that it can also continue to be a place where we can discuss our work as scholarly friends and network within our professional community. But I also expect the LTF and UCALTA and its members to increase their advocacy and outreach work. I think in the past decade we've seen large and important developments in the more cognitive arena, and so we will certainly build on this further, but I think we might also want to balance this a little bit more again with the social and critical side of language testing. And I think the type of fast-paced developments we're seeing at the moment around automatization in language testing will really require that. So on the one hand, strong cognitively informed technological developments, but combined with equally strong considerations of the impact of those developments on the nature, the uses, the consequences of automatizations in language testing. And of course, I also expect this upcoming decade to become the decade of both of you and all other PhD and postgraduate students in language testing. And I hope that the 2021 LTF, which we will be organizing with our language testing research group at Lancaster, will have a similar role and be a stepping stone for your professional trajectories in language testing, like the 2010 LTF in many ways was for me.
Thank you very much, Tineke, for these insights into language testing in the UK in the 2010s. We certainly look forward to what's happening in LTF in the 2020s.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you both as well.